What I want to do for the rest of the session is talk about how we actually choose our investment properties and how we select the properties and some of the due diligence that we do when we're searching areas and searching different opportunities. And I thought the best way to start it off is actually look at historically what's happened in the Australian property market over the years. So I've taken a snapshot of what's happened in our market over the last 50 years, starting from the 70s all the way through, and I've based it on the 4 respective states that we operate in. What I'll do, I'll start off with South Australia, and basically we've started off with the median price in the 1970s, and as you can see, the median price in the 70s was $11,900 in South Australia. So you pick up a house for a fraction of what they're worth right now. Now they say that property doubles every 10 years or so. In South Australia, we actually get it every 9.4 years. So on average, not every 9.4 years, property prices tend to double. So between the 1970s and the 1980s, it actually more than doubled. It jumped from 11,900 to 39,000. Between the 1980s and the 1990s, it more than doubled again. It went from 39,000 up to 100,000. Between the 1990s and 2000, it did not quite double. It only increased by about 50% or $50,000. However, that was the last recession that we had back then. And as you see, from 2000 to 2010, more than doubled again, jumped up to $387,000. Now, if you have a look at Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, there was very similar growth figures all the way through. Right? Now, let's look at what today's median prices are in Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Queensland. So, as of today, the median price in South Australia is actually sitting at $440,000. So as you can see, it hasn't really done a lot from 2010 in the last 6 years. Adelaide's had some challenges in the last 5-6 years, particularly, things like Holden's shutting down, lack of manufacturing, plants and things like that happening. There's been a lack of population growth compared to Melbourne and Sydney. So all these things play a bit of a role, and I'll explain a little bit why a bit later on. If you look at Victoria, again, as I mentioned, there was a very similar growth rate. It's one important thing to note. In 2010, the difference in median price between Adelaide and Melbourne was only about $100,000 difference. So 387 to 485. But have a look at what's happened in Melbourne. Median price is now 725,000. So it's grown significantly more than what Adelaide has. Again, particularly because it had more migration. Melbourne was dubbed as one of the best livable cities in the world. It had a lot more employment at the time post GFC, so it had a lot more people moving into Melbourne than what Adelaide did. Now, interestingly enough, let's see what's happened in Sydney. So Sydney admittedly had a higher starting price point, but it was all comparative. And in 2010, the median price difference was only $10,000 difference between Melbourne and between Sydney and Melbourne, and only $100,000 between Sydney and Adelaide. But now, would anyone like to take a guess what the median price in Sydney is? 1.01 at the moment. 1.018 or something like that, so I just rounded it down to be conservative. But if you have a look, from 2010, in the last 6 years, we've seen Sydney prices double. In 2 years alone, it had 40% growth, which is incredible when you compare it to what Adelaide's done. Or, it's still done well. Melbourne's still done well, but exceptional when you compare it to what Adelaide has. Again, some of the reasons for that is because Sydney had a lot more population growth happen post-GFC, because all the jobs and all the work and all the activity and action was happening in either Sydney or Melbourne. So I know a lot of my personal friends have moved over to Sydney, particularly in the last few years. A lot of people that have graduated and couldn't find work in Adelaide have moved over to Melbourne and Sydney. And what happens when you get more people moving into a city that doesn't have enough capacity to accommodate enough housing to everyone? When you have more demand than supply, price has to go up, and that's what's happened. Now, when you look at Queensland was actually exceptional because it had the cheapest median price back in the 70s. It was only $8,500, and continued to grow even throughout the last recession, based on where it was on the property clock. Queensland still doubled in value, and in 2010 had a median price of $420,000. Currently, Queensland's sitting at $499,000 as a median price in Brisbane. So what this tells us is, when you compare all 4 states in the 4 major capital cities, as far as value for money goes, South Australia and Queensland are definitely where the most affordable places are to invest. When you compare places like Queensland to New South Wales and Victoria, at the moment Queensland is dubbed to be one of the hottest markets in the country at the moment, and I'll explain a little bit why in a second.